This is a lesson revising how to provide analytical comments about the effects of specific language and structural devices when dealing with non-fiction texts. The aim of the lesson is to ensure that you know the types of language and structural devices to look out for in non-fiction texts, that you understand the types of effects those specific language and structural features might be intended to have in a variety of non-fiction texts, and that you're therefore able to identify and comment on the effects of specific language and structural devices both in short specified sections of non-fiction text and also across whole text, including when comparing to non-fiction text. We'll begin by looking at the specific language features that you should be paying attention for, that you should be on the lookout for. Obviously, top of the list with these non-fiction texts are rhetorical devices. So that includes things like rhetorical questions, questions where there is no answer required because it's either so obvious or the writer goes on to give that answer. Groups of three or three-part lists. Be careful with these because for it to be a three-part list it needs to be, or a group of three, it needs to be three of the same or a similar thing. So it could be three particular adjectives, or it could be three sentences that all have the same sort of structure. So do be careful that you are really dealing with a group of three or a three-part list. Use of alliteration, so that's a sound pattern. Use of repetition, which could be repetition of individual words, or it could be repetition of ideas, that kind of thing. Use of direct address, to work out if it's direct address, look at the pronouns that are being used. Use of hyperbole or exaggeration, and when you come to refer to that device you can use either hyperbole, which is the sort of more technically correct term, or it is acceptable to use exaggeration. In addition to rhetorical devices, we do also see figurative devices in some of these non-fiction texts, so do be on the lookout for similes, metaphors and personification. And then there are other sort of miscellaneous devices, such as the use of cliches, puns, colloquialisms, the use of juxtaposition, and a lot of these you will find in the headlines, the titles, the subheadings in particularly media non-fiction texts, but you'll find them in some of the literary non-fiction texts as well. There might also be the use of oxymoron, the use of onomatopoeia, particularly if you've got something like a piece of travel writing where the writer is trying to bring that experience to life for the reader. They will often use onomatopoeia to appeal to the sense of sound as well as the sense of sight. Use of sarcasm, now we're getting into things that establish a tone, that set up a tone. Irony, humour, all of those things help to create the tone and to convey a writer's sort of ideas, their thoughts, their feelings about the subject they're writing about. So there are some of the key language features that you should be looking for in non-fiction texts, both literary non-fiction and media non-fiction. In terms of structural features, you always need to pay attention to the headline or the title. Where you have a media non-fiction text, they will have some kind of title. If it is a magazine article or a newspaper article, it will be in the form of a headline. If it's a web page or a review or maybe a report, that will be in the form of a title. Some of the literary non-fiction texts also have titles, so if it's come from a book, for example from an autobiography, you might get the title of the autobiography at the top of the extract. So do pay attention to the headline and the titles of these texts because they are both structural and also often they're written using a particular language device, so there's quite a lot of mileage in looking at the headlines and the titles of texts. After you've looked at the headlines or the titles, look to see if there is a strapline. If you're dealing with some kind of article, there will always be a strapline. Similarly, in reviews there should be a strapline. You can also look at the use of subheadings throughout the text. Again, they are structural, but they will often be written using a very particular language device, usually the same device for each subheading. So do look both in terms of how it's being used to break up the text, but also the language feature that's being used in constructing those subheadings. Look at the topic sentences. How do they guide you through the text? How do they make it easy for you to understand the information being provided. Again, similarly with topic sentences, look at the markers, look at the connectives at the start of those paragraphs and at the start of sentences within paragraphs. Are they using temporal markers, sequential markers, causal connectives? Pay attention to the types of connectives being used and how that guides you through the information being provided. Look at the sentence structures and the sentence forms, and remember, don't refer to them as short and long sentences. You do need to use the correct terms: simple, compound, complex. And again, with the forms, you need to refer to them as question, statement, exclamatory or imperative. Look for the use of lists, 3-part or otherwise. Any kind of listing is always worth stopping and having a look at because it's a very particular structural device. Look at the kind of information that is being listed and the effect that has on the pace and the impact of the information being provided in that list. Look at punctuation. Writers will tend to use punctuation for particular effects, which obviously is something you need to do in the transactional writing. So do pay attention to the use of punctuation, particularly where you get things like semicolons, colons, and exclamation marks. Look for the use of motifs running through a text. This is a structural device. A motif is a repeated idea or a repeated image that runs all the way through, and obviously repetition works as both a language device and a structural device. Look for the overall organisation. Is it linear, non-linear, cyclical? What kind of how is the writer presenting that information? Are they presenting it to you logically, or maybe in a piece of autobiography or travel writing they're flitting around in time and space? And then look for the links between the very opening of the text and the ending of the text when you are dealing with whole text in response to question 3 and question 7b on paper 2. Right, so we're clear now about what we're looking for in terms of the specific devices, but what we now need to do is understand what is meant by this term effect. If we're being asked to comment on the effect, what is it that they want us to comment on? So the effect of a device could be the way that that device is showing the reader how the writer thinks and feels about the subject they're writing about. It could also be the way that that device makes the reader think and feel about the subject, so how the reader is manipulated through the use of particular devices. And it can often be a combination of both of these. So the language and the structural devices will reveal to the reader the writer's thoughts and feelings about the topic they're writing about, and will manipulate the way the reader responds and forms their own thoughts and feelings about that topic. So they're the kinds of things you're looking at in terms of the effect. So we're focusing on paper 2, and we're going to focus on the questions on paper 2 which require explanations of the effects of either specific language or specific structural devices. So on paper 2, the questions which require this sort of response are question 2. Question 2 asks you to identify a direct quote, a short direct quote from a very specific section of text 1. It will be a very short section which you will be directed to through the use of a line reference, and you're then asked to explain how language is used in the example you've given to convey a particular aspect of sight. Question 3 on paper 2 is also about text 1, but this time it requires a detailed analysis of the way that specific language and structural devices have been used across the whole of text 1 to make it interesting and engaging for the intended target audience, the reader of that text. With question 3, it is important to remember that you must comment on specific language and specific structural devices to get more than half marks. If you only comment on language devices, you can't get more than half marks. If you only comment on structural devices, you can't get more than half marks. There has to be a mixture of both of those. Then question 5, this is a question about the second non-fiction text. For this question, you will be provided with a short direct quotation from text 2, and you will then be asked to identify and explain the effect of a specific language device used within that quotation. The final question, which requires the explanation of effects, is question 7b. This is the longer of the comparison questions, and it is asking you to compare both of the texts and make comments about how specific language devices are being used in those texts to show the readers how those two writers think and feel about a common aspect of sight. So remember, you're comparing the presentation of maybe an event or a theme or an idea or a particular subject, and you have to write about how those two writers think similarly and differently about that particular topic, about the focus for those texts. What we're going to do now is to look first at the two low tariff short answer questions, so questions 2 and 5. Then we'll consider question 3, and then we'll move on and consider question 7b towards the end of this lesson.